Oh, is that you, Nathaniel? Yeah. Got it. It's okay. I'll print it out and I'll actually add it to the picture or to the wall before I take a photo of it. All right, it's 9:30, so let's get this train wreck of a day going. Thank you both for appearing today. I really appreciate it. It's very interesting teaching a face-to-face class. Only a few people show up, and most of it's online. But again, I really appreciate you guys being here. That's part of the whole game. Looks like a small crowd online today, just one person. So it looks like as we get closer to midterms, this is kind of what I was expecting. More and more people would just be watching these lectures as a recorded event, but that is okay. So week 6 already, here we are. So today we're going to be talking about the wonders and paradox of urban life. And the reason I enjoy today's lecture is because we're going to start to connect our actual lives that we live every single day, and not so much really focus on the past, but start to link what we've been talking about for the last few weeks and how we actually live today and the challenges that we're facing today. So let's kind of dive into this one. Today's roadmap, pretty standard. Today's activity will be called repackaging industrialization. Announcements, I don't have anything for you guys. It's kind of a standard kind of weekend, not much going on. You guys, anything? Nah? You guys joining us virtually, if you have any announcements, please let us know in the chat. I'll be more than happy to pass those along. So for opening circle today, when we talk about the world around us and the different ways that we kind of feel about it, if someone were to ask you, can you generally live without fear, hate, greed? If I were to pose that question to you guys, I think pretty much absolutely all of us would say, yeah, you can definitely live without those things. But what about love? Can you actually live without love? And so kind of posing this question brings up an interesting dichotomy of that, well, if we feel we can live without certain emotions, but feel that we have to live with others, then what does this relationship look like to the urban world? And so one of the most interesting things for me about being a planner is that we attach emotional relationships to the world around us. And so one of the ways I kind of like to get into this territory is this idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which came out some time ago. But basically what he proposed is that in order for a human being to actually get to the point where they can feel safe, comfortable, engage with the world around them, and actually theorize and have desire to have change in the world or cause change, you kind of have this hierarchy of needs. So starting at the bottom, your basic physiological needs, air, water, food, shelter, etc. And if you can secure those things, then you can move up to the next level, safety needs, personal security, employment, health, etc., etc. Once you secure those, and again, this is not an absolute, this is interwoven, you can move up to love and belonging, friendship, intimacy. Only then can you have these things if you have these things below. Once you got love and belonging, you can get respect, self-esteem, recognition, freedom, strength. And then from there, you can move on to self-actualization, an actual desire to be the most that one can be. So this is just one of many kind of theories and systems and ways of organizing the world around us put forth. But as an urban planner, the reason that I find this connection so fascinating is that we're not just putting forth cold design, right? We're not exactly like Apple, where it's like, here's the next iPhone, love it or hate it. Here's the next device, love it or hate it. We're actually trying to think of the world around us and actually what people want to see in the world, what we like about the world, what we want to engage with the world. So we will say things all the time like, I love living in this part of town, or I hate driving to the west side. But never so much will you say, no, don't go downtown. There's too much greed there. Like, that's not something we really assign to the world. Or you'll never say, I'm jealous of my Albuquerque home because it does not have beachfront property. So when we talk about the world around us, we kind of have this paradoxical relationship of belief and feeling, which isn't really rooted in anything beyond philosophy and things of this nature, yet we're dealing with a very physical, very tangible world. And so let's kick forth this idea of the 21st century, the age that we're living in today. And so if we were to think about US city development by the century, we've touched on the idea that the 19th century was really all about the rapid urbanization, the rise of cities, how we used industrialization to support this mass workforce, this mass population, this huge drive of consumerism within the urban environment. And then if you move on to the last 100 years that we've just experienced, it was really about decentralization and suburbanization, right? So technology allowed us to get out of the city, out of this, what we perceive to be the dirty and the evil city core, and out to the suburbs where everything was advertised as this new way of life. And then if you really kind of think about it today, well, it's kind of a weird paradox. And the way I like to frame this is both wonder and paradox. So, for example, we talked about the rapid urbanization of the US cities 200 years ago. Yet if we take a look at today, one of the things that I brought up in our very first lecture is this idea that in 2009, for the first time ever worldwide, we now have 54% of the world population living in a city. And here in the US, you can see that as 81%. And as I've discussed, we crossed this threshold back in the 1920s, where 50% of the US population was now living in a city. So even though 200 years ago, immigration and influx into cities and cramming people into tenement housing feels like a very foreign concept, like we would never do that today, as part of the 21st century city, we are very much still engaged in that process. So while even though older generations may have flocked to the suburbs, younger generations currently living in the city today are revitalizing the city core, coming back into the city. And so when we think about the wonder of urbanization in our society around us, and it's very paradoxical that here we are spending so much time and effort to get out of the city, yet younger generations are now coming back into them. So what does this mean for the 21st century as we move forward with urbanization? And one of the things that we always like to point to today is that, well, there's a bigger demand for public transportation. People aren't driving as much. And so I threw that statistic out to you guys that back in 2014, 16-year-olds getting their driver's license for the very first time dropped, and we have never seen that before. Well, here's where data starts to get a little bit weird as we enter our modern era, or our modern lifestyle. So if you flash back to vehicle ownership, where we left off is about the 1990s. Purchasing cars for the everyday American kind of stabilized, and we reached about a 50% threshold. So back in 1990, there was 134 million cars on the road, and a total US population at the time of 249 million, which basically means one car for every two people. Well, that of course is the US average. And so if you actually take a look at cities, it is much lower in urban areas, or higher depending how you look at the statistics. So just as an example, at this exact same time, if you look at vehicle ownership in Raleigh, North Carolina, only 4.22% of households did not have access to a vehicle. And so while we think about, one of every two Americans at this time, it doesn't sound like a whole lot, but when we're reframing this from urbanization, you can see just how much of a role vehicles play in cities. Now today, we got kind of a little weird, and we kind of skewed the data a little bit, because vehicle ownership in the 90s really didn't stabilize. We just changed the way we counted vehicles. So for instance, cars, depending on what weight class they were in, just got legally reclassified. So now SUVs are technically light trucks. We also have the rise of the pickup truck in the 1990s as an urban vehicle. Minivans, we now have this idea of suburbanization and the vehicles that we need to support that kind of lifestyle. You also have the rise of specialty vehicles, Teslas, Hummers, things of this nature. And so when you fast forward to today, the closest statistic that's currently available is the 2018 census. And right now, 8.7% of all US households are without access to a vehicle. So if you think about this number here of just Raleigh, North Carolina as an urban population, and only 4% of households not having access to a vehicle, And you look at today and you see 8% of US households not having access to a vehicle. You start to wonder if something's wrong there, or if there's a shift in the way that we're engaging this culture of automobile ownership and the levels of freedom that it means. But the thing is since we kind of reclassified this stuff, we honestly kind of lost track of vehicle ownership. So when we're talking about the urbanization of cities, personal transportation, it tends to get a little skewed. But today, there's also this huge challenge that kind of rose up out of these previous ideas of urbanization and industrialization, is that when you have this many people within a smaller confined space of a city, you need the ability to organize. And especially since we predominantly operate around industrialization, the working class, people coming to work, things of that nature, one of the challenges is that we've really applied this one-size-fits-all to all the different levels of planning policy. And so today, which really started in the 20th century and we widely use today and we find socially be acceptable, is that we took the 24-hour day and divided it into 3 chunks. So we have specifically taken 8 hours dedicated to work, 8 hours dedicated to leisure, and 8 hours dedicated to rest. And so as part of 19th and 20th century industrialization, we kind of forced ourselves into this schedule. Now, the problem is that, of course, this is a paradox because this is not actually how we live, and we are borrowing time against each other in the different parts of this model. So if we have overlapping time, we're taking time away from one section and making it for another. So just as an example, if you have an 8-hour workday and you have a 1-hour lunch on your own, well, that's not considered the work time. So where are you pulling that from? Are you taking that out of your leisure? Are you taking that out of your rest? Commute times to get to work, average 30 minutes to 2 hours. Where are you pulling that from, right? Most U.S. adult households are both adults in the home are working to make ends meet. And it's kind of really, you could tie that into the idea of keeping up with the Kardashians, right? Or, how it used to be keeping up with the Joneses. This idea that, well, both parents don't maybe necessarily need to work, but they feel they have to keep up with this type of lifestyle that's being advertised to them. And we touched a little bit base on that when we started talking about suburban lifestyles and the selling of washing machines as a form of leisure time for women. And we'll dive into that in detail next week when we really talk about suburbanism, because that is really how we are building the world today. So it's very paradoxical that we took this organization of life and this organization of work around urbanism, around the way that we structure the city, yet we're constantly reshifting and shuffling in order to take time away from other things. But this can be beneficial. So think of this, is that prior to COVID, think about what it was to drive on the interstate. Think about what it was to get from one side of the town to the other during lunch hour, during the 5 o'clock, during the 7 a.m. commute, right? And so one thing that we found out prior to this is that the problem with all of this rush hour traffic and congestion and our response to it has largely been to just keep building more roads, keep making freeways wider and wider. But the truth is we got plenty of road, we actually found out. So what it is if we actually had chosen to stagger the workforce, just as an example, if we're talking about an 8-hour day with a 1-hour lunch hour, if you had a third of the population work 7 to 4, a third work 8 to 5, and a third work 9 to 6, then you're staggering the times that people need to be on the road itself. And so if you did this, you would actually alleviate all the congestion that we have on our highways. The challenge is that pre-COVID, this solution was really socially unacceptable. It wasn't physically impossible. It wasn't bureaucratically impossible. We could make this rule today. But the challenge at the time is that we were really concerned about liability. Well, if I'm going to let you work from home or if I'm going to stagger the workforce, how do I know you're actually doing the work that I need you to do? If you have a large company of several thousand people, how many more people do you need to hire to keep track of who's coming in at what time? So from a bureaucratic kind of industrialization, urban kind of society format, it was just so much easier to say everybody 8 to 5 and then to build the world around the way that we managed people. And so today, one of the things that's really interesting, which we'll talk about a little bit later in upcoming lectures as it becomes more relevant, is this idea of the post-COVID world. What it's now going to mean that more people can work from home and how that's going to change planning as well. And then the other thing that I think a lot of us can get on board with is the other paradox is that, of course, if you're being told when to sleep, of course, that is completely out of balance with our natural lifestyle and our kind of circadian rhythm, because if you think about it, we were really just kind of forced into the schedule within the last 200 years or so, and we have thousands upon thousands of years of a different sleep pattern leading up to this. And so what happens is if you break away from the natural rhythm, which has always been, go to sleep when it gets dark, wake up in the dawn, and in the middle, you actually have this thing called second sleep. And so up until about 200 years ago, it was completely normal to go to bed when the sun went down, wake up in about 4 hours in the middle of the night, actually get up and do stuff, and then go back to bed until the sun came up. And this was called the second sleep. A lot of people theorize this probably comes from our more primordial nature, that when, of course, we were still living around campfires for survival and protection, that we just naturally would wake up every 4 hours to tend the fire. As we became a slightly more industrialized society where people were living in homes and were primarily heating their homes through hearths and still building the fire, that pattern was still there. But people would actually get up in the middle of the night and still engaged in this process. And so people like Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin actually advocated that this was their most important time of the day, that this is when they got the most thinking done. People usually would reflect spiritually and religiously. People wrote books during this time. So the fact that you fast forward to today in 2020, where now you are being asked to sleep in a pattern, and if you are told that if you wake up in the middle of the night, there's something wrong with you, so here's a pill, here's a drug to fix that, we're really going against our natural nature just because of the physical world we built around us. And so when we're thinking about these ideas, it's really interesting to think that the way we organized cities, the way we structured where we live, how we're willing to commute, the sleep patterns and work patterns that we're able to follow, when you fast forward all the way to today, the change is very interesting. So let's kind of walk through this real quick. So if we're talking about the 1800s, we're talking about rapid urbanization for cities. If we're talking about the 19th century, we're talking about decentralization, people getting out of the city. If we're talking about our own lifetimes for the 20th century, we're talking about suburbanization. But interestingly enough, the last 20 years has been a process called exurbs. And basically what it is that today, the US, or the suburban population of the US is now greater than all the people who live in the city and immediately around the city. People who live in the suburbs is now greater. And so what the idea is that exurbs, as younger generations are coming into play, being able to strike out on their own, while we have talked about that many are going into the city itself, many are setting up these communities kind of in these gray areas in between these spaces, and that's what exurbs are. So essentially, exurbs are these really small yet densely packed areas. And they're usually somewhere near the suburbs or around smaller cities. And what the deal is that these areas, while they are smaller and dense, have a greater reliability on public transportation. These people tend to embrace self-driving cars, ride-hailing services, things of this nature, right? Now, this can also be explained by the fact that younger people are not getting their driver's licenses right at 16. And so when we think about that just as a statistic and what might be causing that, we can see that the built environment is also being structured around that narrative. And so what's really interesting about these small clumps of people coming together is that what's happened is they're becoming economic and commuting connections. And so take Silicon Valley, for example, right? That is a exurb cluster of people surrounding one type of specialization who access a very certain type of specific urban affordances. And so here's some examples of that. And so when we're talking about exurbs, we're talking about small, dense clusters somewhere in between suburbia and the cities. So if you take a look at both these examples, you can see that there's almost no room for cars. In the image down here of this exurb, you can see that there's parking down here kind of by the main country club building. And so rather than all these people having pools or their own gyms, there's a main facility that everybody shares. Vehicle ownership, you can see nobody is parked by their actual houses. There is road space, so you can still pull up, drop off your groceries, or have them delivered, depending on what you're into. But the space for the actual cars is by the building itself. You can see this one, the example of this exurb. There's little to no single-family homes whatsoever. It's also located off a major roadway, so people can literally go on and off to the exurb and then jump on the freeway in order to get to the city itself. And so for the last 20 years, this has been a very interesting shift, because as people are now starting to live more in the city, it's not necessarily that they're coming into downtowns to live, but they're starting to build these new clusters, not quite in suburbia, not quite in the city, but kind of engaging in this very different kind of lifestyle. So of course, the paradox here is that essentially what's happening is this new kind of relationship between the way we use space, but also this non-spatial relationship, the social system, the social structure. What is the space actually supporting me as a lifestyle? And so, for example, these clusters, even though they're kind of brief systems and they kind of take away from what we traditionally think community planning to be, what's also happening is it's creating kind of these new social clusters around the built environment. So take, for example, right, is that if you don't want to be out in the suburbs where everybody's kind of mixing, but you don't want to be in the city either, you can create your own kind of community like this, if you're a developer, or if you just come together with like-minded people, right? And so let's say you favor a certain kind of religion, and there is an exurb out there that is marketed as kind of people who are part of that religion. Let's say if this was advertised as a really heavy Republican neighborhood, that their marketing, the way that they advertised this was that, you know, this was a safe place to express your politics. But it can also be something as simple too, like walkability, ecotourism. And so it doesn't have to be as extreme as these are political, religious, intensive structures or communities, but it can also be supporting different type of lifestyles. So if you want to live in a community where you can walk, you don't have to be dependent on your car. You're technically affluent, where you can just have everything delivered to you, then maybe this is the type of community for you, and is a type of community that more people are choosing to engage in. Now, much of that discussion has been around pre-pandemic, pre-COVID. So what's really interesting today that we were largely theorizing up until today is that if we take a look throughout history of cities and what has been the technological decentralizing force in all of this, if we fast forward to today, we can easily argue that today the microchip is just as powerful as the rise of cars of the 20th century, the rise of streetcars in the 19th century, and then going back to the way we discussed how Paris and Rome were structured around foot traffic and animal traffic. And so if we're thinking about the microchip as the modern car, the modern streetcar, the modern decentralizing force, kind of what we're talking about today is that prior to COVID, cities were really attractive to younger generations. They were really attractive to more affluent millennials and post-millennials that we hadn't had a term for yet. And so what was happening is because you had a larger upper middle class that was born and raised in the suburbs, they were coming into cities because it offered a different kind of an attractive lifestyle for this population. And so if you're thinking about the microprocessor supporting that population, we know it's cheaper to move information from place to place than it is to move a person from place to place. Amazon's modern day model of cheap and fast delivery of goods has shortened perceived distances. So it's no longer that I need to go down to Sears to order my washing machine. It's no longer that I cut out the piece of paper in the back of my comic book and expect delivery in 4 to 6 weeks. The rise of e-consumerism, eBay, Amazon, things of this nature. Now we can get almost any item we want, regardless of where and how it's made, in a very short delivering part of time. And as we've touched on, self-driving cars has also perceived the distance that we are willing to travel within this new urban environment. And so today you see lots of stories of tech people who live way out in the countryside who commute back and forth quite a bit, falling asleep in their self-driving cars. So commuting is no longer the act of commuting. Some people are seeing that as their time to catch up on sleep or part of their 8-hour sleep cycle. And it's also very interesting because you can get really philosophical on self-driving cars, which, let's face it, I love to do, right? So if you think about cars and car ownership and the idea that you have to have insurance to drive a car, well, insurance is all based off of liability. Based on what I know about you, the data that's available, how certain am I that if I'll give you permission to drive this car that you're going to have in an accident? How much money are you going to cost me? Well, if we're thinking about self-driving cars, now the liability is on the car and not the person. So do we insure the car? Do we insure the artificial intelligence system driving the car, right? So even today, we're kind of struggling with these ideas of the way we've classically organized the world doesn't really meet how we are actually engaging with it. And so you've heard me in past lectures talk about the end of one era, moving on to a new era. And we really feel like we're in this space because the way that we used to operate, we can no longer kind of predict the future. Now, I do want to point out that this is nothing new. That at the time, for example, if we flash back 100 years ago to rise of, the Sears catalog, Montgomery Wards. If you ever take the boat tour in Chicago, the Riverwalk architectural tour, this is actually the old Montgomery Ward's warehouse. So this is the Amazon warehouse of 100 years ago. And so everything that came out of this catalog came out of this building. It's right there on the riverfront, easy access for shipping. The rail yards are not too far away. And so if you think about this model, it has been around for quite a while. It's just you take the microchip and the process of decentralization where now you can program robots to run these warehouses and people can just be where they're at. And so it's no longer this idea that you have to have the mass workforce coming into a centralized area, that now you can do all this decentralized thanks to the microprocessor. What's also kind of really wild about today is that if you really think about the conversations we've been having around housing, it's this idea of rapid urbanization, people being crammed into tenant housing, really horrible living conditions, people using technology to escape the city for greener pastures, so to speak. But then when you think about the microchip as this new kind of powerful decentralization force within urbanization, it does open up a kind of new wondrous world of housing. So if we think about how housing was traditionally acquired, right? You had to qualify for a loan, you had to be able to purchase something. If you were a renter, you had to have first month, last month, damage deposit, possibly your credit was checked, references were checked, et cetera, et cetera. But now, if you even rent, you can, through the magic of Airbnb, sublet an extra space in your home, and you are not the homeowner, but yet you can generate income from living space or just room, right? I mean, certainly in Balloon Fiesta in years past, people on Airbnb have advertised their backyards in a tent so people can come into town. And so what's really interesting about this is it now opens up a new source of income for people today in cities and of course beyond that they would never have had access to, thanks to the microchip and thanks to the systems that it can support. So one thing that has become really challenging, though, is that listings on Airbnb that are not being rented to people are taking away from the regular surplus of available housing. And so what is happening now that we will find in cities is that rather than having a wider ability to rent, people are now renting sometimes 2 to 3 places and exclusively using those for Airbnb rentals. And so what we have found because of this, just as an example, recent data shows that for 1% of all residences on Airbnb, meaning that if you look up just 1% of all the places for rent on Airbnb, and you take a look at the rent that all the other people in the area are paying, they went up by an average of 1.58%, which if you are in Manhattan in New York City, means that you are on average paying about $1,500 extra a year. Now, that's just you living your life, not participating in Airbnb, just trying to find a place to live near where you work, and not really being a part of the system. But because somebody puts an Airbnb in your neighborhood, on average, people will experience a 1% rent increase in their own rental. And so this is kind of a new pressure point. So in 2020, when we're talking about why are more young people living at home, why are we not engaging in this tradition of turning 18 and moving away and going to college? What's going on here? Rather than frowning upon that and saying that there's something wrong with society, we as planners can take a very bigger perspective on this. And so if we think about Airbnb, for example, and we're thinking about the wonder and the paradox of it, right? If we think about New York City alone, just as an example, when Airbnb came to town, they added 616 million just in extra rental fees to your average renter in New York because Airbnbs came into their neighborhood. If you flash back, this means that from 2009 to 2016, approximately 9% increase in rent in New York City alone occurred, particularly in pauper neighborhoods like Soho, the West Village, things like that. And so what happens in all of these places, they see a 20% rise in rent for everyday renters. And so when you take a look at the negative effects of Airbnb, they're certainly present. But we also think about the positive effects, right? And so, for example, when we were talking about 19th century urbanization and how cities exploited different people of color, like the Cotton Club, for example, while that was pure exploitation, it did create this unique little power bubble. Same thing with Airbnb is that while we can largely think of this as a negative impact on the places we can afford to live, Airbnb does help support small businesses that don't make enough money to access traditional commercial areas, right? So let's think of Old Town, for example. If you have family coming to town, they want to experience Albuquerque, you'll take them to places like Old Town and walk around, and they can buy their souvenirs and their trinkets. But what about businesses even smaller than the mom and pop, the entrepreneur, the independent spirit? So what happens is if Airbnb comes into the area and people just have their little front bedroom set up to sell their wares, well, Airbnb has had a huge positive impact on people who can't afford their own brick and mortar enterprise and are using parts of their home. And so it does create these economic little prosperous bubbles in neighborhoods that can only be facilitated by the Airbnb experience. And so just like everything, right? Touches of good, touches of bad. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's always one thing or another. There's lots of gray in between. Now, if we think about the post-COVID world, we've touched on the idea of the microprocessor decentralizing the modern day workforce, the fact that if we just simply would have staggered the workforce to come in on 3 different shifts, we could have fixed a lot of problems. And so one thing that we are going to grapple with in real time is this new idea of the white collar workforce shifting to this new work from home experience that we've always said was possible, but was never socially forced at the scale that we're experiencing it now. And so, well, what does this mean? Well, rather than having central, physically located buildings like the old Montgomery Ward's warehouse, now people can essentially live anywhere on the planet where there's internet service and do their job. This is Dr. I forgot her name. She just recently popped up in the news in the last week talking about the real struggle of this modern movement. And you can see her doing a CNN interview looking very proper and the background looking great. But really, she's doing this on her laptop from her chair in her underwear surrounded by kids' toys, right? And so we've kind of created this new class system almost in real time. So rather than white collar and blue collar, we now have the virtual kind of workforce and we have the essential jobs. And so if you're able to work from home doing like computer programming, analysis of x-rays, right? Doctors don't even have to go into the hospital. They can just do it through those little monitors they wheel into your hospital bed now. If you prepare income tax, they can just email you everything. But now instead of being the blue collar worker, you're now the essential service worker. So, you know, the person stocking the groceries, the people that have got to put tires on your car, et cetera, et cetera. And so as an urban planner, what's really interesting about our time now is if we really think about the world around us and the way we have been designing it. And now we have this new opportunity where there's this huge social movement that has created a lot of positive things. Are we going to design the physical world around us to support the new social structure? Or are we going to bring the social structure back into fold and make it come into line with the physical world around us? And so as planners, what I think is super interesting about our profession right now is we're not only engaged in this discussion of design, but for one of the first times ever on this scale, really talking about social challenges, really talking about social issues. And so this class has never been more relevant. So let's kind of get away from that idea of the workforce and the microprocessor and decentralization, things of that nature. Let's think about the economy that supports all of this. And so just as an example, last week we were talking about the idea of the Frostbelt migration to the Sunbelt migration. Largely thanks to cars, cheaper housing out west, people were able to get out of cities into warmer climates. Well, one thing that we've seen is that as a result of the automobile giving this kind of freedom to people, today we've created these large economically affluent communities, meaning that land in Hollywood was cheap. Hollywood rose to the demand of mass entertainment for people of suburbia. We had this huge influx of money, and now we have these really affluent communities, largely in California, which, of course, as we know, things are shifting right now. But what this means is that the division of wealth and the way wealth has migrated around has greatly changed as well. And so what traditionally happened is that people living in the city, because they were limited by their technology and limited by their mobility, you had a lot of different economic classes all within the same space generally. But what happens is with mobility, you now have the ability for money to be separated and leave certain cities or certain communities and now be tightly clustered in other. One thing that is also very interesting about today is this new idea of Bitcoin and the idea of digital money now. And so since that really doesn't have any physical kind of borders, what kind of space and what kind of changes is that going to create? But if you fast forward to today, certainly what we're seeing now in our own lifetime is that people can now really largely afford, those who have the means, to live wherever they want. Even if you're middle class. Do you want to move to California and be by the beach? Move to California and be by the beach. Are you getting older, live in Minnesota, tired of cold winters, want to go retire in Florida? Go retire in Florida. The problem with that is that when people leave one area for another, they also take a lot of their social kind of collective ideas with them as well. And so what happens is now you get this clustered development of people based on belief. And so it doesn't have to be exurbs where young people are coming together in a new way to engage with the technology. It can also be people moving around based on their economic affluence. And so think about this, right? Think about mailbox income, retirement, right? Essentially what happened is in the 20th century, when we were setting up Social Security, we were setting it up as a safety net for people. So when they got older, they had the ability to retire, in a way that was sustainable. But really, when we set up that system, what we weren't thinking about is technology and urbanization coming together with economic systems like this. And so when you have people retiring and moving to Florida, let's say they worked in the Ohio school system for 40 years. Well, your pension and your benefits from Ohio are still being paid to you by Ohio taxpayers, but now you're living in Florida. And so you're generating money in one place and now spending it in another. And so what happens is rather those systems being circular, where spending and generation is in the same area, now you have people displaced all over the country, money supposed to be generated in one place and going to others. And so we can certainly see this all throughout many places. We've given the example of Silicon Valley. Of course, people participating in that economy and the money going different places. I got ahead of myself a little bit. So think about the Ohio school teacher, right? So making money in Ohio and it going to Florida. But what's really interesting about that too is that has just kind of become the norm for us. I mean, we certainly may have parents or grandparents in different parts of the country already who have been living this way for our lifetimes as well. And so if that is no longer a sustainable model for cities where money is generated in the city and it stays circular within the city itself, but is now being generated in one city and largely being invested in another, then how can the economics change? How can we as planners create a space where maybe we can do something different to revitalize our communities from an economic perspective? And so again, if we think about what we've been talking about, if we think about 19th or 18th century urbanization, we are really talking about cottage industries, mom and pops. You were the local shoe repair. You were the local blacksmith. You fast forward through time to the 19th century with industrialization, and you have the rise of department stores, vast consumerism, things like Sears, Macy's, etc. Where now it's not just you go to the local bootmaker. It's now you just open up the catalog and order it. Certainly in the last 100 years, we've seen the rise of Walmart, Home Depot, that kind of economic structure, the strip mall, the big box store, et cetera, et cetera. And so far, for the last 20 years, we've been heavily engaged in e-commerce. And so when we think about today, we as planners, if it's not necessarily the tax base that our cities are going to survive off of, if it's not necessarily the idea that people who live here make money here in Albuquerque and are going to spend money here in Albuquerque, then how is it that we can use this new kind of model of e-commerce to actually be able to make sure that the money that is generated here stays here? And so while I certainly don't have an answer for that yet, that is something we're actively exploring in our own time. Now, next week, we're really going to dive in to suburbanism and what that means to us. Because as we've kind of talked about, suburban communities are still the dominant community that we are building today. In the past, we've touched on the idea of Western cities and how places like Albuquerque, we don't have a large downtown central core. We have what we have based on how the city was built during early industrialization, during the railroad era. And then since we have so much space out here, when people started getting personal vehicles and personal transportation, we basically just created these giant rings of suburbs all around from downtown. And you'll see this pattern in Dallas, Houston, Phoenix, et cetera, et cetera. And so what this has done, on one hand, is it has created a certain stability for us. So if you're born into a family, you kind of know what the plan is for you already. Grow up, go to college, get married, buy the house in the suburbs, have the 2.5 kids, 2 cars in every driveway, mow the lawn on the weekends, and barbecue in the backyard. I mean, that's kind of the lifestyle that we're all expected to fall into. But the thing is that even though there's now stability in the fact that we are living pretty much the same way our grandparents lived, for the first time ever in the US, you have generations of people that are now living in the exact same way the previous generations did. It does create this real monotony. And next week, when we talk about suburbanization, we're also going to talk about the rejection of it. Why people like us prefer to go to microbreweries. Why people like us prefer to ride our bikes and not be so car dependent. And so certainly next week, we'll talk about the rejections of the suburban lifestyle because, of course, we're much more familiar with what suburban is, but we'll talk about that as well. But we're also going to talk about this idea of suburbanism thanks to the COVID regeneration. And so as we've seen, now we have people from all over the world, all over the US, getting out of cities, buying houses in suburbs all the way across the country based off pictures alone, never setting foot in it, because now essentially they can work from anywhere thanks to the internet. So certainly in our own times, we're going to talk about this idea of suburbanism, the rejection, and this new resurgence. So for closing circle today, just kind of wrap things up. Again, being a planner today, I think one thing that's just really interesting is that the social construction of the city itself, the feelings of attachment and belief we put onto the physical world, it's something that's really becoming part of the dominant conversation. And even though we've been dismissive of emotions and our love for cities and our disdain for certain neighborhoods, one of the ideas is that it's no longer about design. It's no longer about community empowerment. It's really this idea of everything coming together. And so that's why planning is one of the great interdisciplinary things that you can be engaged in and still make a real impact on the world. And so as a planner, I really behoove you to entertain both the political power of good design and the emotional attachments that actually motivate people where they want to live and how they want to live, and how these kind of planning problems that we're thinking about today from this perspective of wicked problems and what it is to really engage with something that's complex. And so this idea of, can you live without love? Can you live without hate? Well, yeah, but the way that we attach these things to the world around us does have more meaning than we generally give it credit to within the world of urban planning. So just to kind of put that into perspective, if we're thinking about today, one of the things that can be really challenging is that no matter where you already live, you're not going to have it all. No community is never going to have everything you want. You're never going to find walkability, affordability, the pool in the backyard, the 5-bedroom, downtown, centrally located, right? So there's certain things that we're willing to, pros and cons, certain things that we're willing to sacrifice in the need of others. So planning is really all about the methods you use to justify your decision. Well, I thought you didn't want to live on this side of town anymore, yet you bought a house on that exact same side of town. So what happened there? So when you get into discussions like this, it's really about how you justify your decisions, but also how you explain those justifications to others. Because we as planners, we certainly talk to each other, but largely what we do is we engage with the public itself, the people who actually live in these communities. And so being able to discuss your justifications about why you did things is just as important. So what we're going to be talking about on Thursday is kind of this idea of US urbanization and a path forward, what it is to retrofit the physical world around us in light of these new social demands. Any questions for anybody today? No? Those watching virtually, if you have any questions, please leave them in the chat and I'll get back to you. Let me get a quick sip of coffee here real quick. So what I wanted to do today for looking ahead was kind of to look ahead not only this week, but coming up towards midterms as well. So just to start off this coming Sunday, for September 27th, you have a selection of readings, reflection and synthesis number 3, and then your final bio statement. I have graded, I want to say about 85% of the bio statements. So I will finish grading those up today as well. So that way, those of you that I haven't gotten to yet can have that feedback. And again, even though if you got full credit on the bio statement of previous assignments, make sure you take a look at my comments because there are some things in there I just recommended to change for your final version. And then since reflection and synthesis number 2, your peer reviews were due this past Sunday, I'll start getting those graded as well. But let's look ahead a little bit beyond this week. And so next week is the start of week 7. We're presently starting week 6 right now. So next week, at the end of that week, you'll have a selection of readings, your final peer review, and your idea journal number 4. And the week after that, we're actually going to spend the 2 days of class working on our midterms. And so starting on week 8, that Tuesday in class, I will actually be giving a live demonstration of Google Sites and Adobe Spark. For those of you who may not be aware, UNM did negotiate a deal where all UNM students get free access to the Adobe Suite software. So Photoshop, InDesign, Illustrator, et cetera, et cetera. But one of those things is called Adobe Spark. And so I'll actually teach you how to use Adobe Spark and also how to get free access to Adobe if you haven't done that already. And so Tuesday will really be all about live discussion about how to set these up. And so for those of you that come in face-to-face, we'll be able to do that in person. For those of you who watch the class virtually, it'll be a little bit different because I will just have the camera centered on the screen and I will be over here at the computer largely just driving, navigating the website and talking as I talk. But then I will also have my laptop nearby so I can look at the chat and answer questions while lecturing that you bring up in the chat window through the live stream. So Tuesday we'll be doing that in 2 weeks. And then Thursday, we'll actually be having an in-class working session. And so that Thursday, for those of you watching virtually and those of you face-to-face, we will actually be here in the classroom. We will be building our web pages live. We will be getting our content posted up. By this time, we will have voted on our URL, and I'll be talking about the URL more on Thursday about how that survey is going to go out and any suggestions you guys have put forth on that. Any questions about looking further ahead as we come up towards midterms? Those of you watching virtually, if you want to leave any of those questions in the chat. And my email is going off like crazy today. All right, so let's kind of talk about the midterm, even though it is 2 weeks, because this class is very different in the way we're approaching our midterm. So in many traditional classes, there's usually some sort of exam that you cram for. You show up, you stay up all night the night before, you show up, you take the exam, you turn in a long 5 to 10 page paper, you design some sort of project on the fly, whatever the case may be. Well, this class uses a process called distributive practice. And so what that means is rather than having everything due for a midterm, we've actually already been working on it for the first 8 weeks of this course. And so the things that you will actually post to your midterm webpage is the stuff you're already working on. And so your bio statement, we've had 3 iterations of that with the final and 3rd iteration coming up due this Sunday. Your bio statement will go on your webpage. You guys had your 60-second video introductions that you recorded for this past Sunday. Those will go up on your midterm as well, your website. And then what happens is that the midterm itself is a blog publication of 800 words plus or minus 10. And these are not new writings. You don't need to come up with this. You've actually been already doing this through your journal assignments and your reflection and synthesis. And so you can actually go back to any of your previous assignments and you are going to freely edit any of those things together that you want into a much more concise and solid 800 words. And so basically what we're doing is that for the last several weeks, idea journals have been much more informal. It's really just about, getting anything off your chest. And reflection and synthesis has been really about this idea of setting the stage, setting the context. What is the topic? What is the definition of that topic? How would an academic talk about this topic, but also how do I personally feel about this topic? So it's a little bit more structured. And so you've already been working on it. We'll certainly talk about it a little bit more as we get closer. But essentially, when it comes time for the midterm week, it's really focusing on the design of the website, becoming comfortable with that process, and then taking the content you already have and being able to fit it in there. Does anybody have any questions about that? Kathy says, I don't like my 60-second video. That's okay. So if you're not a huge fan of it, you can actually re-record it if you want. It's two different things, right? There's the assignment portion where it's like, you have to get this done, you have to practice it, you at least got to engage in it. But then at the same time, if you do want to go back and redo it, you certainly can. So that's okay. I mean, it's the same reason why we're going back and using our idea journal and reflection and synthesis, because maybe we're not totally satisfied with what we were saying and we feel comfortable enough putting it out there to the world through a blog. And so that's why we get a chance to go back and edit. So let's talk about Here Be Dragons. And so if you're not familiar with this phrase, I guess that's all there is. So if you ever flash back or see these images of classic medieval maps or maps from the era itself, you'll actually see, lots of dragons, lots of sea creatures, lots of monsters throughout these maps. Now, a modern interpretation would say, oh, these people actually believed these things were out there. Like, oh, if you sailed too far east from Helgala, that you would actually encounter the red dragon who would destroy your ship. Well, that's not actually the case at all. So what we've come to learn over time is that if you ever see a dragon or a sea creature or some type of monster on these classic maps, dragons and monsters were actually just representations of the unknown. So it's not that they actually thought these monsters were out there, is that they just said, well, we're not really sure what's here. So they put a monster. Well, what happens if you sail west from Helgala? Well, we don't really know. And so that was represented by a dragon. And so what we're going to be doing is taking this idea and applying it to our paper city. And so for those of you watching virtually rather than flipping the camera, what I'm going to do, because this is a wide angle camera and you can barely see the wall as is anyway, after class today, I'm actually going to take a picture of our little paper city that we've been drawing and putting on the wall over here. And so what we're going to do is I want you to take a look at our paper city that we've been building through these class activities. And I want you, if you are savvy enough to do this digitally, download the photo that I'll be posting onto the Learn site. And I actually want you to find a picture of a dragon. And I want you to take a look at the city we've been building. And I want you to indicate a place or places that you are seeing some problems with our city. And so just to kind of recap, what we've been doing is we took the idea of the 19th century city, really high density, people crammed into a small amount of space. Things were largely built at right angles, not a whole lot of design going into it. But then we also had the idea of the 20th century suburb, where around the city, people developed these kind of new neighborhoods and kind of flooded out of the city towards them. Well, of course, if you have rapid urbanization where people just flood into cities and things are built quickly, there's going to be some problems. When people just completely abandon cities and flock out to the suburbs, and suburbs are built kind of, willy-nilly and randomly and kind of quick, there's going to be some problems there with how they're connected. And so for Thursday, what I want you guys to do is after class today, I will be posting a picture of our paper city. And I want you to go in and I want you to put a dragon in the spot that you are seeing a problem or problems. And then on Thursday's class, we're actually going to talk about those a little bit. what the problem is. And so when you put your dragon on the paper there, also indicate why that is a problem for you. And since most of you are participating in the class virtually, we'll do the activity that way today, so that way we can engage in it. But some things to consider is this idea of community-based asset mapping. And so this is kind of a tool that we planners use when we're evaluating communities, cities, suburban areas, whatever the case may be. So if people are expressing that there's a certain problem with their community, well, some of the things you can ask from a human perspective, right? If you're thinking of the human assets, well, where is your job? Where do your kids go to school? What streets do you actually use to get from point A to point B? What parts of your place do you enjoy? Do you worship? Where is your church? Where do you get your food from, et cetera, et cetera? If you're thinking about where you live, or maybe like I touched on earlier, since most of us are not from New Mexico, if we moved here, how did you decide to where you wanted to live? Did you consider the wild space? Did you consider water? So did you want to be close to the Rio Grande? Are there physical characteristics? Do you specifically want to live by the beach? Do you like living by the city? Did you want to make sure that you were near a recycling center, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And then community assets. So it's not just necessarily the people, it's not just the environmental affordances of the area, but how large is the community and who is competing for these things? So let's say the place that you live is near your job, it's near your place of worship, it's an area you enjoy because it is in a wild space down by the bosque, and so you feel like you have more physical characteristics. But honestly, how many other people are competing for those same assets? When you ride your bike along the Rio Grande Trail, how many more people are you encountering? Is that a positive or negative experience? How does the community use or even care for these assets? So do people who use the Bosque Trail throw a lot of trash, or do they take care of it? Does the community structure their identities around these assets? So if we're talking about the foothills, if we're talking about the Bosque and the river area, do people proudly promote as something they are proud of their city for? And so I will post this as well. And so this is something to consider when we're taking a look at our paper city and the things that we may be identifying as dragons or problem areas of the development. Anything for wrapping up today? No? Those of you watching virtually, if you have any questions, please feel free to email those to me and I'll be happy to address those. But that's it for today. So I will see you guys Thursday. Thanks a bunch.